Well, good evening, everyone. Happy International Women's Day. It's a great pleasure for me. I'm Carl Stitchin, Professor of Law and Dean of the Law School and Chair of the University's Equality Committee to welcome you here this evening. And we're delighted to have this event and to have some fantastic speakers this evening, so I won't take very long because I want to hear them, and I know you do as well. I'm very pleased that this university is hosting this event. We know that City women have been doing extraordinary things throughout the history of City, and it's good to see us claiming that history, reclaiming that history very proudly through our portraits on the walls and through hearing the stories of the lives of the many women who have done remarkable things, hopefully with the support of this institution. International Women's Day, of course, marks a call to action for accelerating gender parity. And this institution, we all know, has a lot of work to do going forward in order to achieve that goal. As chair of the Equality Committee, I'm well aware that we're far from perfect, but many of us have a strong commitment to doing better in the future than has been done in the past. And that's, I think, represented by our Athena Swan action plan, our Gender Equality Action Plan, which is a far-reaching agenda that many of us are deeply committed to implementing and committed to change in this organization, addressing gender equality and representation, progression, and the working environment for all its staff. Now, last year we hosted a thought-provoking panel debate chaired by ITV's Penny Marshall, where leading City academics discussed their research in the area of gender parity and debated the different tactics and strategies for achieving it. Again this year, we have a fantastic audience I can see to talk about tonight's thought-provoking debate on women in the workplace and what does professional look like. So without further ado, I'd now like to hand over to our chair for this evening, Professor Lis Howell, Director of Broadcasting, to introduce our esteemed panel. I hope it's a great evening.
Well, hello everybody, and thank you so much for joining us this evening. It's really exciting. The first thing I have to say is this is not University Challenge. It's ladies, women, and what's more, it is University Challenge, because we're going to challenge some of the beliefs that are commonly held, particularly about the way women should look in the workplace. And I speak as someone who started work in about 1968 as a part-timer. You know, I was a cleaner for somebody, and I went and worked in a garden centre, all the things you do around about university time. And it was absolutely astonishing then for women to wear trousers. So in a way, I can see that things have moved on, but also it's so depressing to see how little they've moved on. And what we want to do tonight is have a panel which is about the panelists, but we don't want to do the male thing of jawing on while you listen and then a couple of guys put their hands up. We want it to be interactive, almost from the start. Obviously our panel are here to tell their story, but please feel that it's about you too. We want to hear from you, and we're going to have a much greater question and answer section than you might have thought. So start thinking now about points you want to make, questions you want to ask, because this is something we're all involved in together. This isn't about a panel opining at you. It's about all of us together trying to reach some sort of consensus on what the answer should be to this very subtle and difficult problem of how women dress. And in a way, as a person who's been in and out of feminism over the last 40 years, the dress issue is something that didn't dare speak its name somehow. You know, in the early feminist days, it was dungarees and flat shoes and all of that. And then some of us didn't want to do that, and then some of us did want to do that. And it's been a complicated issue. How you dress at work, how you present yourself, what you want to be, what you want to look like is actually really quite important. And obviously, what we're really working towards is people being able to do what they want, but to do what they want in the knowledge of the message that they put out, and in the knowledge of what other people take from that message, and in the knowledge of the sort of imposition that will be honest. It's such a complicated subject, and to think it's for the fashion pages is just so wrong. This is something we've all got to engage with every day of our lives, both working lives and casual lives. It's really, really important. So I'd like to introduce the panel, although you probably know who everybody is. On my far right is Dr Florence Sutcliffe-Braithwaite, who's a lecturer in history at UCL and is a historian of 20th century Britain, and will try and put these complicated questions into a sort of context, because nothing is without that context. My issue about wearing trousers at work is probably a 30-year-old issue, but it's still an issue for me. So we have to talk about all of these things in the context of history. Next to Florence is Angela Jackman, who is a senior law lecturer and a partner at Simpson Miller and an alumna of City University, who has a fascinating take on the problem of hair, how we expect hair to look, Afro-Caribbean hair, but I would suggest it's also a problem for all of us generally. It's the judgmental issues that people have with women and how they look. On my left is Charlotte Proudman, who in a sense has the proud title of being called a feminazi. The trouble with these labels is they spin off the tongue. They're really quite clever, you know, but actually that's a hideous phrase, and Charlotte had to put up with that after objecting to her picture on LinkedIn being commented on by a much older bloke in a sort of sexual way. You know, oh, you look gorgeous. Really, that was not the point of LinkedIn, we all know that. And Charlotte took that on, and great for her. And then on my far left is Nicola Thorp. And Nicola is actually the woman of the week, in my view, because there was a parliamentary debate on Monday night about Nicola's issue, which was being sent home from her job as a part-time receptionist because she wasn't wearing high heels. And in fact, that's been taken up by the press, and it gives itself to loads of headlines about heels, high heels, yada yada. But the point is, should in the workplace an employer tell you as a woman how to dress? There is, under the Equality Act, a code about dress codes for men and for women. But if you read it, it's subtly different for men and for women, and employers can, at the moment, impose some dress codes on women, and there are very, very weak sanctions for those who take it too far. So that's the background, and at some point I'm going to ask you, right from, well, very near the start when you've heard what Nicola has to say, to actually come out and vote on what you think the House of Commons debate should have led to. But in order to do that, you need the evidence, and to have the evidence, we have the key witness, and that's Nicola. So Nicola is going to tell us now what happened to her and why this became such a co-celebra, and we're really, really thrilled that she's spending time with us this evening. So Nicola.
Thank you. Good evening. I'm Nicola Thorp, and in December 2015 I was sent home from work because I was wearing black shoes. I turned up as I normally would to a temp reception job in the city in a smart suit jacket, suit trousers I think I was wearing, even though they wanted me to get changed into their uniform dress. But I had flat, smart shoes on. No different to like a court heel, just didn't have the heel bit. And she said to me, well, you can't wear those. I said, why not? I've worn them for the past 2 years for every receptionist job I've wanted to. She said, I'm sorry, it's Portico's policy that all women must wear a 2 to 4 inch heel at all times. And I laughed, and she didn't like that. I pointed at a male colleague and said, well, he's wearing black shoes. You're not sending him home. He's doing the same job as me. I think this is sexism. And she laughed again and rolled her eyes and said, well, there are plenty more girls who will happily wear the heels, so either go out and buy a pair or lose your job. So I left. Very upset and confused and angry, and first person I called was my dad to say, can I borrow some money because I can't afford my phone bill, and I've just been fired again. This is actually the 4th time that it had happened to me. Not the 4th time I've been fired, but the 4th time that I've been turned away from work because I refused to wear certain types of makeup, uniform, or heels. Nothing unusual in terms of the type of business that I was working in, but what I felt was unfair because of my gender, if you will. So I called up Citizens Advice and said, this is what's happened to me. I think usually wear high heels in regular life and men don't, you don't have a very strong case, and actually it's reasonable that your employer would expect you to wear high heels. So I went home, dejected, didn't really know what to do, and then I googled, how do you change the law? And set up a petition on a government website, which is where Google directed me. And yeah, within 3 days of that petition going live, it got over 100,000 signatures, thanks to lots of wonderful women and men across the country who agreed with me that change needed to be made. And then as a result of that, it was 10 months later, I was in Parliament on Monday and the topic was debated. But as I said, it's a much wider topic. My issue was about heels, a woman in heels. But the laws and the grey area in the law that allowed for that to happen need to be redressed, in my opinion, because it affects lots of other issues for women, and it's, I think, an intersectional issue.
So how would you like the law to be changed?
So, there's two things. At the moment, an employer has a right to impose a formal dress code on employees. Fine, don't have a problem with that. They also have the right to distinguish between a male and a female dress code within reason. Now, whenever an employer is given a within reason area to work, normally it's the woman who is at a disadvantage within reason. So I would argue that that needs to be scrapped, and we should have one gender-neutral dress code that either gender or sex can choose from. Happy days. Also, at the moment, it costs £1,200 to take an employer to tribunal for a discrimination case, and if you win, you can only get, up to £1,000 or something like that.
So you're going to make a loss before you start?
Exactly, and it takes 28 weeks to come to a decision, and during that time, you have to put up with what you're fighting against.
So what I'd like to do is ask everybody here, in all honesty, if you would like the law to be changed so that it's the same dress code for men and for women. And that's, lots of things come into that. For example, we were talking about a man with a ponytail who was asked not to wear a ponytail, and they used the law against him because men don't normally wear ponytails. But if we would like the law to be the same for men and women, how many people here would like the law to be the same for both men and women? And think carefully about the implications of this. How many people would like it to be the same? So we have maybe a 2/3 majority. Okay, that's great, thank you, because we want you to participate, and we want to see at the end of this discussion whether you've swung one way or another. Thank you very much, Nicola. Let's go to Charlotte now, because your experience, and you are a lawyer, was a little different, but it impinges in the same way.
Yes.
It is about appearance.
Yeah, I mean, it absolutely is about appearance, and I myself had been, I suppose, objectified on the basis of my appearance. I mean, since early days when I was doing my undergraduate in law and looking for work experience in solicitors' firms, and then that continued throughout my profession. I think perhaps one of the reasons for that is not only because women tend to be viewed on the basis of whether they conform to a certain ideal, but also because the law and other types of professions tend to be male dominated, and so women tend to sort of stick out like a sore thumb in some ways, and therefore is sort of almost preoccupation with the way that you look. And if you don't wear makeup, or if you do wear makeup, or if you wear heels or you don't wear heels, it's a choice perhaps to a certain extent, but it's one that can be scrutinised in often unpleasant ways, and whether you choose to wear makeup or not, it's one which reflects upon you and the way that you're perceived, as opposed to perhaps always your work-based performance. And that's what we want to be judged upon. If we live in a meritocracy, we want to be judged upon the work that we're able to perform and our ability and experience. And I think what was interesting about my particular case study is that the whole idea of speaking out against being objectified in that way became such a huge media storm because it was a deviation from cultural norms. Ordinarily, and for decades prior to today, women have often taken it as a compliment or said thank you and so forth. But then actually saying, no, this isn't acceptable, I do want to be judged on the basis of my experience, then became a matter for scrutiny by the media, and I was viewed, as you say, as a feminazi, which is obviously a highly derogatory word to use. And
Tell us what happened. You put your picture on LinkedIn and there was a particular response that you objected to.
Yes, I mean, it was just quite simply, as you say, it was a response in terms of, oh, you look great, rather than, oh, I can also see that you're a fellow lawyer, you've done X, Y, and Z, and it'd be great to work with you on that basis, as opposed to I'd like to work with you because you're really hot.
Can I just ask you, your picture wasn't enhanced in any way, you weren't doing it, no.
But I mean, even if you were, and some women do have very exciting, flamboyant LinkedIn images, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're saying, hey, I'm single and ready to mingle. No, it's not Tinder or Grindr or whatever type of social app that one chooses to use, quite far from it. But again, the idea of objecting to that became an issue in the sense that I was not conforming to the usual response that a woman would give. And in a way, that sort of tends to be a way of policing women's bodies, and we know that we're often under surveillance, and the way that we look is often the way in which certain people judge you, and unfortunately that tends to be very much the case within the workplace today.
Right, so let's move on to Angela, because you're sort of across both worlds, because you yourself wrote a campaign is perhaps too strong a word, but maybe not, about hair and the way hair is used. And that's the sort of thing when, in my experience, if you talk to, in all fairness, male colleagues about something like that, they like, oh, what's the problem? Everyone's got hair, But it's a really, really big issue. So Angela, tell us your story.
Yes, if you don't mind, I'm going to stand at the
just stand at the length and deliver.
and deliver.
Whoa! Sorry.
So my perspective has really been looking at the whole issues around discrimination in the workplace and dress codes from the perspective of BAME women. It's obviously been an issue within the community, and it really, I think, came to the forefront last year when it was picked up in the press. And I think it's interesting how it links into an extent, Nicola, with your campaign, because the Petitions Committee did take some evidence around the very specific issue around BAME women, their hair, and as a result of putting an article on City's website that was picked up by the clerk to the committee, and I was invited to submit some written evidence, which I did. So I'm conscious that I'm just going to give a quick overview because we very much want to hear from you. But just to make clear that this is an important and serious issue, many people started thinking about it last year because there was a very significant article on the BBC website looking at this issue about what is professional from the perspective of BAME women. And as you can see, the headline was, "Where a weave at work, your afro hair is unprofessional." And the article interviewed a number of black women who recounted having very negative, humiliating experiences at work because they were basically told, you're not permitted to wear your hair in its natural form, which may sound ludicrous to most of you, but I spoke a bit earlier today to the BAME network, and many of us kind of understood and were aware of lots of other women who have experienced this. And this is happening to black women in different sectors and professions, irrespective of what their posts or qualifications are. To get away from some of the irritations of real life, I picked up the wonderful book Americana by the highly acclaimed Nigerian feminist author, who many of you I'm sure would have heard of, Chimamanda Adichie. And it's quite interesting how some of her storylines really pick up on this issue of our hair and our perceptions and how it really impacts on us individually and professionally. And I thought I'd just share, when I read this, I thought, this links in so much with what's happening over here and really across the diaspora, where we as BAME women are minorities. And just to give you a flavour, she talks very much about her main character, and this is a quote from the main character, fictitious: "My full and cool hair would work if I were interviewing to be a backup singer in a jazz band. But I need to look professional for this interview, and professional means straight is best. But if it's going to be curly, then it has to be the white kind of curly, loose curls, or at worst, spiral curls, but never kinky." And I kind of really related to that, and it was interesting that a number of friends who had read this also said she really talks a lot about hair, it's really inherent to us. So dress codes we've touched on, but clearly dress codes can extend from the wearing of jewellery, piercings, through to hair, style and length. And from the experiences set out in the BBC article, it's clear that there is a practice happening whereby we're being attacked at work and told you can't wear your hair naturally. And really, as far as I'm concerned, that clearly potentially amounts to a discriminatory dress code. My view is that all women should have a choice over how they wish to wear their hair, how they wish to present themselves. You know, there's a whole range of issues that come into play here around how we identify as women and how we present professionally. And I feel very strongly that workplace dress policies have really got to be brought in line to reflect the diversity differences between us, and not, in relation to the issue of hair, impose European values on us, because that's effectively what's happening. Your natural hair, your nappy hair, is uncomfortable to us, and we're not going to permit you to come to work wearing it in its natural way. And I think this feeds into the whole broader issues around recognising diversity amongst different groups, and it extends beyond heels or hair, but also looking at the different needs and wishes and expressions of communities, and looking, for example, at cultural dress, which I think is another whole area that we can talk about. I feel very strongly that this whole issue is open to potential challenge under the Equality Act. Now, obviously, we haven't got very long, and I'm not going to bore you to tears by talking about the specifics of the definition of racial discrimination, but it's complex. And an example of indirect discrimination, which I think would apply here, is a policy which states that all employees are required to have straight shoulder-length hair, because that inevitably is going to exclude some people and have a disproportionate impact on kind of individuals who form particular cultural or heritage groups. Very proud of all the work that you did, Nicola, and all of the hassle that you put up with. We were looking at an article a short while ago, so there's still the hate or negativity coming through, despite the fact it being such a serious issue and being taken very seriously by the House of Commons Petitions and the Women and Equalities Committee. They heard oral evidence and they considered written evidence. And just to give you an idea of why they asked us to present at City University evidence about the issue affecting BAME women, at their first sitting where they heard oral evidence, there was a woman, BAME woman, who turned up for an interview by an agency that was recruiting for Harrods. And she was told, this is what she said to the committee, she was told, you can't work for me unless you have your hair chemically relaxed, because your hair as it is not professional enough. And she said to the committee, well, we just sat there and nodded and agreed because we needed the job. And there's complete power imbalance. So you see the quote from Americana, whilst fictitious, reflects the real experience of African Caribbean women. It's something that's very, very inherent and important to us. Now, the committee, I think, goes on to make very strong recommendations, which include asking the government to review the law, Parliament to amend it, and to give great power to employment tribunals so that they can impose much more kind of punitive orders or awards against employers. And they also suggest, for example, detailed guidance and awareness campaigns targeted at employers, workers and students. And I would say that these similar measures really ought to be recommended for African Caribbean women facing discrimination at work based on how they or we wear our hair. And moving forward, I would say that time is right, really, for someone who's in a sufficiently secure position to bring a challenge. And I would hope that there's going to be scope for further successful publicity and campaigning initiatives such as undertaken by Nicola and also Charlotte, and the adoption of the race equality charter by employers so that there's safe space within places of employment for BAME women to feel that their issues are taken on seriously and addressed and moved forward, and potentially strengthen the Equality and Human Rights Commission. That's all I wanted to share with you. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks, Angela. Let's now go to Florence, who can put this in some sort of historical perspective, I think, about women's clothes, women's attitudes, the way women are viewed, the attitude of men to women because of their appearance. Can you give us some sort of contextual background? Because I would say, on the basis of my own experience, that there has been progress in the last 50 years, which is when I started work, but it's not great progress. Is that fair?
Yeah, so I was going to talk about 3 different examples from history which illuminate in different ways how clothing, what women wear, is a really powerful symbol of what women are allowed to do, and the ways in which a huge amount of anxiety has attached to what women are allowed to wear. So the first of my 3 stories goes back to the mid-18th century, when 2 very impressive women, Elizabeth Montagu and Elizabeth Vesey, created a set of literary assemblies or conversation parties. At these parties, guests were encouraged to exchange witty conversation about literature and philosophy, and card playing and heavy drinking were banned. These became very famous, attracted lots of the great intellectuals of their time, and after a while, people in this circle started referring to themselves as blue-stocking philosophers. It's not entirely clear where that name came from, but it probably related in some way to the fact that rather than spending a lot of effort thinking about what types of stocking they were going to wear, they were spending more time thinking about intellectual ideas. So this term at first was one that they chose for themselves and that could apply to men and women. What's really interesting is the way that the meanings of the term changed over the course of the 19th century. So originally, this term means a woman or man engaged in kind of literary pursuits of the blue-stocking circle. But by 1822, you find William Hazlitt, a notable author, writing, quote, "I have an utter aversion to blue stockings. I do not care a fig for any woman who knows even what an author means." By 1896, another example, we've got a medical publication writing, "By the highest mental education, girls may be made into blue stockings or neurotics, or both together." So you can see that within the space of less than 100 years, this has become a term with derogatory connotations that could be applied to any intellectual woman. This is a term which is still used today to keep a certain ideal of femininity and intellectual pursuits very firmly divided. My second example of anxieties about women and dress comes from the late 19th century, and this is the furore over the new woman. So the last 2 decades of the 19th century saw the emergence of the idea of the new woman and of a generation of new women from upper middle class backgrounds who questioned whether marriage and childbearing should be inevitable, and who pursued new careers and new educational opportunities for themselves and other women. Often these women were suffrage campaigners, educational reformers. They often questioned the virtues of marriage. They were often writers. So you might think of a writer like Olive Schreiner, or a character of hers like Lyndall in The Story of an African Farm, which she published in 1883. And these new women, importantly, were very closely related to 2 things that were inextricably connected: bicycling and wearing trousers. And the 2 went together because it wasn't very easy to ride a bicycle if you were wearing the typical kind of upper middle class women's dress of the mid-19th century, which would involve corsets or very restrictive and elaborate dresses. So wearing trousers and bicycling are 2 things which go together in giving women more freedom, and physical freedom, but also intellectual freedom. And the huge anxiety that was generated by the idea of the new women was very closely related to anxieties about what these women were wearing. The final example I'm going to talk about comes from the late 20th century, and here I'm going to talk about Margaret Thatcher. Not for most feminists a feminist icon of any sort, but someone who had a very interesting relationship to dress. Thatcher, of course, very much emphasised traditional norms of femininity in her speeches and the way she talks about her family in public, and backing that up very much in the way that she dressed. Arguably, given the fact that Margaret Thatcher was very obviously, by having ambitions to become leader of her party and Prime Minister of the country, breaking out of some of the traditional norms for women of her generation, arguably it was even more important for her to sort of shore up the sense that she wasn't challenging norms of femininity in any really radical way. So in a 1974 interview, you find her emphasising that she always prioritised her family and saying, "We always have breakfast together, no matter what, and no matter how late it is when I'm in London. I see my husband and sons." She actually had a son and daughter, but that is what was printed. "At the end of the day, I always see there's plenty of food in the fridge." And this idea that she's a woman who always takes care of her family is very much mirrored in the power suits, the careful hair and makeup, and of course, the handbag. Very traditional markers of femininity, which allow her to kind of marry professional image with symbols that show that she's not really radically challenging gender norms. And interestingly, she also used other types of clothing as symbols to indicate the sort of femininity she didn't want to approve of. So, for example, in a speech at the Conservative Women's Conference in 1989, she played on the association between feminists and dungarees, saying a Labour Britain would have 8 new ministries, including a Ministry of Women, dungarees only, no hats allowed. So you can see her using clothing to indicate a type of feminism that was trying to break down assumptions about what women should do, assumptions that it should be a woman's role to make sure there was always food in the fridge. It should be a woman's responsibility to take care of the children. Women's work was less important than men's. So yes, I think that things have changed, but it's really interesting that across this time period, and I think right up to the present, we can see that clothes consistently very powerful symbols of what women are allowed to do, whether they're decorative or whether they're allowed to be intellectual, whether they're allowed to work, whether they're allowed to get involved in politics in the public sphere. Clothes are really powerful symbols, and that means they've also been particularly powerful as a kind of locus for anxiety.
It's interesting, we made the point about University Challenge earlier. I don't know if you saw in the paper about the criticism of the number of men on University Challenge, the programme on the TV where universities compete against each other. But one of the points that was made was when women do star on University Challenge and do very well, they're then particularised because of their appearance, particularly the lady with the eyebrows and so on, you know. And it's always, or usually, about appearance. It comes down to appearance. So thank you so much for that, Florence, because that does give us a historical perspective. And I also recall my own mother talking about after the war, the new look, the Christian Dior new look, was actually a form of trap, because suddenly you had to wear different foundation garments and you had to wear a big skirt and you couldn't move so easily, and this absolutely fitted in with the men coming back from the war and wanting their jobs back. So they stuck you in the house in a big frock and you couldn't move. So it's really practical stuff. But now you've probably had enough of us and we'd like to open it to you. I'll just tell you one tiny anecdote about hair, which is very much related to City University. I used to have long hair, I think it was really important, and so I had straighteners everywhere. I had straighteners at home, I had straighteners in my handbag, I had straighteners in the office, I had straighteners in the car for an emergency. My daughter had a pair of straighteners in case I ran out. And one night we were travelling somewhere and I realised I'd left my straighteners on in the office, and I had to ring security at City and say, I'm really sorry, I've left my straighteners on. If there's a fire, it's down to me. Next week, I cut my hair. So, over to you. Hi. Lady in the stripes. Oh, sorry, I should say woman in the stripes. Oh. Lady.
Hello, my name is Holly. I'm a proud survivor of a Harrods agency worker. And I'm also the Universities and Colleges Union rep for PhD students at City. I just wanted to ask the panel what they thought about unions in the workplace, because we talked a lot about legal education, about your rights, rights, the Equality Act, fighting discrimination, funding employment tribunals, campaigning, organising, and it's one thing that nobody's talked about yet. So, thoughts on unions?
Yeah.
Okay, left to right, right to left, so to speak.
Well, because I'm an actress, I'm a member of Equity, so I'm, supported in terms of their work. But on this work, because I was a temp, I didn't have a union, so I don't have anyone to talk to. Harrods is the interesting one. It was the Harrods woman that had spoken about the BBC. I don't know if I did have a union or how to contact them. Is there a union for temp workers? I don't think that there is, and this is why companies like, so PwC were the company who employed Portico, who employed Career Legal, who employed me. 4 levels of employment, and the people at the top went, oh, it's nothing to do with us, it was your policy. And they went, well, it was their policy, it was their policy. The onus should be on the person at the top to check what everyone else is doing. But I don't really know in terms of trade union who you can
Practical
go to.
advice, a union for temporary workers is the one. What is that? Is it no? Nothing?
No.
Well, if you're working here, obviously there's UCU, yeah.
But obviously because you're a temporary worker, you could be anything.
Yeah.
Interesting. Nicola. Sorry. Nicola. Charlotte.
Well, as far as I'm aware, there's certainly no union for barristers, although we perhaps do need one, even though we're lawyers ourselves. But it does seem there should be certainly more union action for temporary workers, and it seems that is indeed a loophole or a lacuna in terms of actually bringing forward a legal action with support, because it's so incredibly expensive to fund any type of employment tribunal action. I mean, you talk about the 1,200 in terms of an initial fee, but as you say, the power differential between who you're up against, often a corporation or a company who have huge amounts of money to throw at litigation, and if you're an individual or a litigant in person, it's impossible to put forward a strong defence, or indeed if you're bringing an action. The levels of differential in power are huge.
As we said, you're going to make a loss, probably.
Yeah, you're absolutely probably going to make a loss unless you win and obtain significant sums in damages, and then you can perhaps fund a union for those who are in temporary workers. That may be one way forward.
We do have an anti-casualisation committee, which is fighting the casualisation of the workforce in higher education. But yeah.
Nicola, you could perhaps give a structure on this. Sorry. Everyone's got her own magic. Must be the hair straightening. My brain.
I don't know. I'd be surprised if there wasn't a union that would pick up and deal with the issues affecting temps. And obviously there are kind of very specific unions for professions, but also more generalist unions. There are certainly unions for solicitors to join. So I'd be surprised if you couldn't organise through
that. It's interesting. But it's about women, because we talk about everyone's talking about the gender pay gap, etc. And what contributes to that, correct me if I'm wrong, is a lot of women take on lower paid temporary work for whatever reason, and they're the women who aren't protected. So this is why it's unfairly affecting women over men. But I would be interested to see, if somebody joining an agency or self-employed as well, educating those women and men as to who they can contact.
Florence, do you have a take on this, or is it not yours?
Not particularly, other than to say that some of the big unions, like Unite or a sort of a union like Community Trade Union, might be interested in fighting these kinds of battles.
Yeah.
Okay, any more questions? Hello, yes.
I did sociology at City, and I did my topic on my dissertation on feminism and what people wore. And I was having this conversation about the heels and the appearance, and we were thinking of why this could be. So apologies, because it's quite a long question, and don't shoot me for it. So I was thinking, like in history, or in the biology, in the animal world, so like peacocks and fish. It's the men that adorn themselves, that have the means to look pretty and flaunt. But in humans, it's women, and it's also women that are meant to historically be chaste. So that, I feel, puts us in a double sort of, like a disadvantage. This is just my personal opinion, and hence when you say go to a male-dominated workplace, which is where I work now, we have double the sort of disadvantage, and it's not really a question, so to speak, but it's kind of like, how do we combat this? As in, like, you know, it's quite difficult for us to break out of, except ignore it and just go about your day, which is kind of what I do. But,
it may not be a question, but it's a very useful comment, very interesting comment. Yeah.
Because ultimately for men, they have a suit, and it doesn't matter what sort of, essentially what class you are, where you come from, a suit's a suit. You can get a suit very cheaply, you can get really expensive suits, but a guy turns up in a suit and that's professional. Women, girls are allowed to wear suits with ties at school, and then when you're 18, 16, 18, suddenly the tie becomes a masculine thing.
Yeah, I mean, that's incredibly interesting, particularly with the recent presidential campaign where Hillary Clinton was scrutinised for wearing her power suits, and she was scrutinised for the amount that they cost as well. Whereas Donald Trump, I never heard anybody mention his outrageous hairstyle, attractive. And instead what he did was objectify other women, particularly the lady from Fox News.
Megyn Kelly.
Megyn Kelly, that's right. And some of the comments he made against her in her physical appearance were atrocious. But actually, I think when you work in a male-dominated environment, you often are taught to take on particular male attributes, not only in terms of being overconfident, which then can often be seen as aggressive or ambitious, which is a negative connotation for women, but in terms of appearance. So within the law, often barristers will wear wigs and gowns, and this has been going on since the 1600s or so on. And it's a way of showing, obviously, that you're male, that you're old, that you're wise, that you're astute. And women then are also taught to take these attributes in this particular type of stereotype, I suppose.
It's interesting because when I was getting confused on the panel and Angela said it's been a long day, it's been a long day for me because I was also chairing a panel at the Oxford Media Convention, and it was a group of men on this panel primarily. There was a woman from Channel 4, and I was trying to find one of the men to brief him in advance, and I said to another man, I'm looking for X, you know, what does he look like? And he said, oh, he's got slightly longish, mouse-coloured hair, and he's wearing a suit but not a tie. And I said, yeah, can you be a bit more specific? Because they were all like that, wall-to-wall men like that. And it did strike me very much that I had worn the same suit and the same jumper and the same scarf as I did this time last year to go to the same convention. But it really worried me that I was wearing the same thing, but I couldn't think what to do. Then I looked up, they're all wearing the same thing. And it really is different. The pressure on us is different. You worry about what you wear in a different way. So it's absolutely fascinating. And this idea of you're supposed to be both chaste and also flamboyant, it's very confusing. It's not the animal world.
Whereas in the animal world, I'd see it slightly more even. Like, you know, like the males do the chasing for the mating,
and they look
but
great.
they also have to adorn themselves. Therefore, they take on the responsibility of doing it. Whereas it seems like for us, we take on the responsibility of looking good, and we have to sit here and be lovely, and
Florence, do you think that clothing is a form of subjugation then? I think clothing is a form of subjugation, or am I just being bitter and twisted?
I suppose it depends how you're defining subjugation. It's a very academic answer.
Sometimes I feel that we're made to dress a certain way to put us in a certain place, and in a way that men are not.
Well, I think that these debates, and especially with the power of social media, will hopefully mean that we can start redefining and feeling confident about the standards that we're going to set for ourselves, and to break out from these limitations, and to not feel that we have to sit there and look pretty and not be too aggressive.
And that gets harder as you get older.
Whatever you do, you're criticised. So I would hope that we can rebuild armours on ourselves so that we can change this going forward.
Question over there?
Yeah, so recently on social media, you see the depiction of feminists in skirts and heels, particularly referring to, Pete Souza, who's a former photographer for President Obama. He posted a picture of several White House staffers with their heels and their scarves, and President Obama, and their heads were cut off intentionally. Well, to prove the point of there are more women in the Obama White House than the Donald Trump White House. My question, though, for all of us is, why does it have to be a woman in a skirt and heels, or the bathroom marker that depicts a woman in a dress and it could be a woman in a cape? I mean, there's so many levels of this. And also now with this movement of feminist t-shirts and the Women's March, when can we just accept a woman in no matter what she's wearing and looking like, and how do we take a step forward with people in our life to bridge this conversation that it's not what we're wearing that makes us a feminist or a woman, it's who we are.
Who'd like to start? It's very, very difficult.
Yeah, that's a massive question.
I think it's really interesting that some feminists have tried to push back against the idea that feminist means dungarees, these things that have become very negative and pejorative stereotypes about what feminist means, that it means being unattractive. And they've done that by saying, actually, we can apply that label to ourselves, but also dress how we want to and make ourselves look nice in the way that we want to. And I think that that is useful, because I think it is starting to do what you're suggesting we need to do, which is to break down these very powerful symbolic associations between a particular type of clothing and a particular type of woman. So I think we need more of that, and more of emphasis on diversity.
Yeah, just one thought on that. I think that there's been a sort of divide within the feminist movement between liberal feminists and radical feminists following the sex wars, which may be familiar with the sort of Catherine McKinnon versus Janet Halley. And within the liberal feminist movement, it's often an argument that using your sexuality, using your femininity is a form of power and currency, and actually you can move up the social ladder or the career ladder by utilising that to your advantage within a patriarchal context. Whereas on the other hand, the radical feminist argument will usually say, actually we need to break down the patriarchal structure itself, rather than simply trying to reform it from the inside. And I think with those types of differentiation within the movement, it's caused somewhat of a conflict between what it means to be a feminist and what it means to be a woman, and how to break that down, because obviously there's, I suppose to some extent, there's a problem with conforming to an ideal version of what it is to be a woman in terms of thick, thin, blonde hair, big boobs, white, often highly sexualised and gendered. So conforming to that, but on the other hand also being feminist. I think it's important to be reflective in the way that you make these decisions and recognise what it means in terms of the context in which you're situated in personally and professionally.
Less of a question and observation, and it sort of leads from the comment from our sociology alumna about sort of display and chaste. But I also think, sorry, beg your pardon, I also question, and we haven't raised it yet, we've talked a lot about what do men expect of us in a workplace, particularly where it's a male-led hierarchical organisation, which many of our organisations are. But I think women dress for women, predominantly. We impose those kind of standards upon ourselves. When I think about what I'm going to wear for the day, you know, that existential crisis in front of the wardrobe every morning, if I don't have one suit to pick, I think about my day, but I also think, I wonder if anyone's going to notice what I wear today, and I expect it will be women colleagues who do. I met Susanna as I came in, and I said, great frock. I even knew where she bought it from, because I recognised it. But
I do think that we say that to each other to be nice. We'll often say, that's a nice scarf, or I like shoes, or whatever. And that's really a way of saying, I like you. And I'm supporting you, but that's the currency we use. Sorry, you've been having your hand up.
There's been a very subtle shift though, so it kind of comes back to what Florence was saying about the new woman and the controversy around dress. It caused such a furore in the press, as you said, and you know, there were so many articles directed at women and against women for what they wore, and we still see that nowadays. Like the particular example that I'm thinking of is the edition of the News of the World that came out on New Year's Day, that was basically women scantily dressed, plastered across the front pages, and oh my gosh, aren't they awful, look, they're marauding around the streets drunk. That rhetoric hasn't changed, but there has been a subtle shift, whereas in the late 19th century, with the new women, it was very supportive, it was women supporting women to change things. Now, often, it's women pulling down women. It's women who have been very, very subtly shifted into a rhetoric of criticism and observation and micromanaging themselves to fit in with an image that is often constructed by other women, by their colleagues and by their peers. And totally what you were saying, like the negotiation you have with yourself every morning, when you stand there and you think, okay, what am I doing today, and who am I going to be around, and am I going out after work, and do I need to
Who cares? Just put clothes on and go to work. It's not going to affect how you do your job. It's not going to affect how professional you are or what you think of yourself, or at least it shouldn't, but it does. And that's, we're 120 years down the line, and you are sitting in a room of some of the most educated women in the country, and we're still talking about what we wear. It's ridiculous.
Yeah. A relatively older person. No, not relatively old, an old person. But it takes a long, long time. It really does. So, did we have any more questions? Yes, sorry, yes, a question. There's a lady over there. Oh, Carl, but can we take this lady here first?
I saw you on TV talking to Piers Morgan. And I watched it this morning. It's not a good way to wake up. But my immediate reaction to specifically the shoe issue is surely it's an occupational health issue. I don't understand it as an aesthetic concern at all. You can't, as soon as an organisation asks you to sit in a chair, you have to have an evaluation. Is that chair going to be okay? Are you seated at a certain distance from your computer screen? Surely demanding that anybody wear a heel, and we know that they're not healthy. They may look fine. We've all been trained to think that that looks sexy and attractive, but it's not healthy.
No.
It's never been healthy.
The report that the Petitions Committee did focused quite a lot on the health and safety issue. And when they asked the MD of Portico, who's called Simon Krabs, when they said, why didn't you do an assessment? And he said, I simply didn't think about it because he'd never worn a pair of heels. That's why it's important that we have women up top in business, because there just are things that guys, to their credit, would never even think about having to assess. There's a huge thing. Read the report, and it's all online. There are pages and pages and pages of how it affects a voice. There was a study done on wearing high heels can restrict your breathing and make you a lot more likely to lose your voice, actually.
But today at the convention I was at, the two very important women spoke. One was Rona Fairhead, who's the outgoing chair of the BBC Trust, and the other was Sharon White, who is the new head of Ofcom. Both of them wore particularly noticeable high-heeled shoes and new tights and skirts. And I found that quite disappointing in a way. But there is definitely a feeling that it's power dressing. It looks great. And that's what these women, who are really iconic and at the top in media, chose to wear.
But isn't there, to be controversial, isn't there an issue about choice? So one of my colleagues who I work with in a related organisation, we've been going off to firms and having meetings, high-powered meetings. I don't wear heels. I've never felt comfortable in them. And she felt the need to say to me, well, I'm just going to take my high heels out of my bag. I know that you disapprove, Angela. And I said, no, I don't disapprove. The issue is choice. And it's whether, if you want to wear heels, if that makes you feel more confident, fine. We all have our different forms of armour to make us feel more powerful and in control. And how people perceive us is important. We can't get away from that.
That's so true.
And if it's dress that feeds into that, then that's a very difficult one to overcome. So I think there's an issue about self-censorship as well. So if women choose to wear heels, mess up their back, give them problems with their structure, but
give them funny voices.
Yeah,
but
they need the choice.
Sorry.
I'm delighted that this is living up to its billing. Fantastic. So thank you very much again. But I did want to come back to the issue of intersectionality that was raised earlier, just to recount. Speaking to some of my female students who go off on work experience in law firms and come back, and are in my office saying how awful it all is. And one of the things we've talked about, because in my office you talk about clothes, is a group of women that I in my school who say they are completely defined by what they wear in a law firm because they wear the hijab. So that as the Muslim women, in the stories they come back with of what they've experienced in law firms, where people they've just met seem to feel at liberty to ask them all sorts of personal questions about what they're wearing. it is, and I think it's important to recognize these different experiences of different women and the intersectional perspective, or the experience that I know friends, many gay women have had about, how about notions of femininity and expectations that they are kind of expected to live up to. So I think it's the acknowledgement of this range of perspectives.
It's a huge range. There's a very interesting article in the Times today in the fashion pages by a gay editor of Elle magazine saying that she's never worn high heels, but she's trying it for London Fashion Week. It's quite amusing in some ways about the plaster she goes through and things. But in the end, it's about she wants to wear the high heels and she feels great. It's a complicated issue. I think what we're trying to say, not trying to say, what we are saying, is that it's a question of the imposition. It's the imposition that's the problem. If you make a choice yourself, you make a choice yourself. But to have a dress code that's unsuitable imposed upon you, that is the problem. We need to draw to a close, and I'm always very conscious when we have these great debates that that's sometimes all they are. We just talk, and it's quite cathartic and interesting, but what actually happens, and having been in and out of the feminist movement for 40, 50 years, I think that you do have to do things. I'm very keen that we do things. So first of all, I'd like to ask you, now having listened to the debate, what is the ratio of people who think the law should be changed to make the dress code equal between men and women under the Equality Act? How many people think now that it should be equal? I would say that's probably a 10%, 50% increase. So that's the other thing is, if you look at this article, which was a parliamentary sketch, which was in the Times yesterday. It's by somebody called Patrick Kidd. Now, I'm a journalist. Love journalists and everything. This article is actually quite snide, and it's about the debate, and it's the picture of Nicola, it's on our left. If 10% of the people in this room write to access this on the Times website and complain, it will make a big difference. A lot of the time, we don't take action, even relatively passive action. We talk and we get upset and we go to the pub or the club and we moan about it. But if we do things, things will change. And I know this myself from my own research into expert women on TV and radio. We just counted the number of women experts on flagship TV and radio news and then pointed it out. And it's a very slight change, but it's getting better, but we have changed things. So if you are proactive and you complain, if you complain, things change, and we really do have to move things on. In my time, I've seen so many feminist actions really go nowhere because people didn't pursue it and people didn't complain enough. This dress business is the sort of thing that can easily be brushed off, but it's so wrong, it's so important. And if I could just appeal to you to think about what you can do. I signed the petition, I didn't even know Nicola. It really got traction, the petition was great. But if it ends up in a rather sterile debate in the House of Commons with just a few people there and a snide article in the Times, it's not worth Nicola's wonderful time and wonderful impression and the things she's done. And the same with Charlotte. So we've got to do things. We really have to make it happen. Sorry, that sounds a bit impassioned, but I feel impassioned. So we'll make it happen. Okay, thank you to our panel, and thank you to you. Thank you.
To see so many young women engaged in this particular discussion, and it shows that there's a real feistiness amongst women to create a change.
When you really think about it, you realise that it really is at the forefront of everyone's mind.
I think the imposition we place on ourselves of conforming to societal and other norms was really quite striking.